My parents left me at boarding school at 9. Years later, they named me guardian of a stranger, so I made them face what abandoning me created. I'm a 21-year-old guy, and I was sent to boarding school when I was 9. My parents said it was to give me the best education money could buy. That's how they explained it to everyone, and that's how they explained it to me too. The truth, which I only found out much later, was that they just didn't want to deal with raising a kid. They told some relatives in passing that it was time for a break, but no one thought it was serious enough to challenge. No one told me anything. I remember the day they dropped me off. It was early September. My dad parked the car, my mom signed a few forms, and within minutes they were back in the car and gone. I didn't even get a tour of the place with them. I spent that first night in a room with another boy who'd already been there a year. He didn't talk much. I cried under the blanket until I fell asleep. I kept staring at the school phone by the hallway door, hoping they'd call. They didn't. For the first year, they called maybe once every few weeks. Sometimes it was just a couple of minutes. Sometimes they didn't call for over a month. I used to wait near the phone room after dinner in case they tried. The staff told me not to get my hopes up too often. I stopped waiting after a while. The school itself was top tier, I'll give them that. It had great facilities, well-funded programs, and teachers who cared, but it didn't take long to realize that for most of the other students, this was just a temporary thing. During Christmas or Easter, their families would pick them up. Summer came, and the dorms would empty out. I stayed behind. By the time I was 11, I already knew the drill. Holidays meant a nearly empty campus. A few of us stayed, kids from overseas or kids like me who didn't have anyone coming. The dorm supervisors would sometimes organize movies or board games, but it never felt like enough. You could hear how quiet the halls got when no one was around. When I turned 13, one of my teachers slipped up. We were talking about cities, and she asked if I'd ever visited the city my parents had moved to. I had no idea what she was talking about. I thought we still lived in the same town. She froze, realizing what she'd said, and tried to brush past it. I went to the admin office to call the only number I had on file. It was disconnected. I sent 3 emails over the next week. No one responded. At 15, I gave up trying. I stopped waiting on visiting days. The school staff noticed, and a few of them stepped in quietly. One of the sports coaches helped me set up a part-time job in the library. Another teacher made me a birthday cake that year. They never said anything directly, but I think they understood. They tried in their own way. Summer breaks became a time to work and stay busy. I signed up for enrichment programs, took extra courses, and did research projects. It was easier than going home because home didn't exist anymore. When people asked where I'd be during break, I just said I was staying for an academic project. By senior year, I had become one of the top students in my class. I got selected as captain of the track team, and my college applications were strong. The staff helped me fine-tune them. When the invitations for graduation were printed, I sent one to the address I had. There was no reply. Graduation day came. Everyone was hugging their families, taking photos, and loading cars. I stood at the gate with my suitcase, waiting. I stayed out there for nearly 4 hours. People stopped asking if someone was coming. Eventually, the headmaster walked out, gave me a look I'll never forget, and offered to drive me to the train station. We didn't say much during the ride. He handed me a water bottle and paid for the ticket himself. What my parents didn't know, what no one knew, was that I had already planned my escape. During senior year, I'd taken 3 part-time jobs and saved every penny. I found a cheap apartment near my college campus and signed the lease on my own. I never told the school staff. I didn't want to be talked out of it. When I stepped off that train, I didn't go looking for anyone. I went straight to the apartment. The keys were waiting in a lockbox. I unpacked my bags, set up the mattress on the floor, and sat there in silence. That was the first night I realized I wasn't a student anymore. I wasn't anyone's son either, not really. I was just a guy in a bare room, starting from zero. But at least this time, no one was going to disappear on me. The first semester of college was rough but manageable. I kept to myself, worked long shifts in the dining hall, and took early morning classes to free up time for side jobs. After the move from boarding school, I didn't bring much with me. A suitcase, some clothes, old notebooks. I used a fold-up mattress and a second-hand desk from a buy-and-sell board. My meals were mostly peanut butter sandwiches and rice with canned vegetables. I didn't expect anything better. One night after a lecture, I sat down and wrote a letter. I printed out a few of my graduation photos and tucked them in the envelope. I didn't write much, just that I had graduated, moved to college, and wanted some kind of closure, any explanation. I mailed it to the only address I'd ever known. 3 weeks later, the envelope came back, stamped and read, "Moved, no forwarding address." I took that letter to the college counselor's office. The woman at the front desk looked confused until I explained my situation. No contact with family, no one to list for emergencies, no support. The counselor sat with me for nearly an hour, asking questions gently. Then she explained how I could apply for legal emancipation and something called independent student status so I wouldn't lose my financial aid. While the paperwork started, I picked up more shifts, campus bookstore on weekends, delivery app in the evenings. I sold some of my old school gear to freshmen, textbooks, a barely used calculator, even a suit I'd outgrown. That got me through the next 2 months. I used coupons, skipped meals, and kept everything written down in a notebook: rent, bills, textbooks. I learned fast. Over winter break, the dorms emptied out again, just like school. One of the guys from my economics class noticed I was still on campus and asked why I hadn't gone home. I just said my family lived too far. He shrugged and invited me to stay with his family for the week. I almost didn't go, but I figured one hot shower and a meal couldn't hurt. That was the first time I saw what a normal house looked like during the holidays. His family had photos everywhere, home-cooked meals, inside jokes. His younger brother dragged me into a video game tournament. His mother handed me a blanket and told me to grab snacks from the fridge whenever I wanted. I stayed 5 days. She texted me later that month, before finals, to ask how I was sleeping and if I needed anything. That was the week I decided to search, not out of nostalgia, more like curiosity. I opened a free trial on one of those property lookup websites and typed in my parents' full names. The results hit fast. They bought a new house in another state 4 years ago. The house was in both their names. I found a school newsletter with my mother listed as a volunteer. Then came a blog from a local park event where they had been photographed alongside a girl who looked about 7. A daughter, someone I'd never heard about. I created a blank social media account and searched their names. Within minutes, I found the profiles, family photos, vacation albums, birthday cakes. One post had all of them at a beach resort, matching outfits, all smiles. The caption said, "Our world." I stared at that post for 10 minutes. I didn't comment. I didn't message them. But I found a distant relative's profile, someone I vaguely remembered from early childhood. I sent a message, just asking why no one had reached out. The reply came a day later. It was cold, said I'd always been difficult, never grateful, said my parents had done their best, and that I should get over the past. That was the last message I got. They blocked the account after that. I deleted it and never tried again. After that, I buried myself in work. I doubled my course load and applied for internships like my life depended on it. I got accepted to a competitive program for students in public policy and started working part-time for a local nonprofit. One of the staff members there introduced me to journaling, not the diary kind, but structured entries with facts, timelines, and personal documentation. I started writing it all down, not to dwell, just to make sense of what had happened. I recorded everything I remembered: names, dates, conversations, places. I wanted it on paper, something real. I kept the returned envelope and the graduation photos in a file with my journal. At some point that spring, I sat down with the counselor again. We updated my records for emergency contact. I listed the friend's mother. She didn't know I had done that, but I couldn't think of anyone else who would actually answer the phone if something happened to me. I didn't tell her, and I didn't tell him. But from that point forward, I made a decision. I wasn't going to write letters again. I wasn't going to send emails or check their profiles. I had already spent too many years standing in doorways, waiting for someone who wasn't coming. The story from here on out was mine and mine alone. It happened during a quiet week between midterms. I was checking my university email like I usually did before class, when I saw a message with a name I hadn't read in years. It was from my father. The subject line was simple: hoping to talk. The body was short, 2 or maybe 4 lines. He asked if I had time for a conversation and said they wanted to reconnect. I stared at the screen for a long time before doing anything. The address was real. It wasn't spoofed or fake. It matched the old one I remembered, though the domain was new. I didn't reply. I forwarded the message to my college counselor and flagged it for later. I took a screenshot and sent it to the friend whose family had taken me in over winter break. That night, we sat down and talked it through. No one gave me answers. They just asked what I needed and what I was willing to risk. After a week, I responded, 1 line. I asked, why now? Why after all this time, after all the silence? The next reply came quickly. He said that their daughter, my half-sister, had seen my name in a student spotlight article. Apparently, my photo and a small write-up had been featured on the university's website for a scholarship I'd received. She had asked questions, and that's what had prompted the email. He said they wanted to be better, to make amends. Nowhere in the message did he mention the past. No mention of boarding school, no mention of missed holidays, no explanation for why no one showed up at graduation, just a line about moving forward. I answered again. I asked directly, why had they left me at that school for so long? Why had they moved to another state without telling me? Why didn't anyone come? His next message ignored all of it. He wrote that we should stop looking backward and instead build something new. No details, no honesty, just vague talk about reconnecting and letting go of bitterness. That's when I replied with conditions. I said all communication had to stay in writing. No calls, no surprise visits, no contact through third parties. I made it clear I was legally emancipated with full financial independence. I told him I'd already designated my emergency contact years ago, my friend's mother, who had shown up when they didn't. 3 days later, a message popped up from a new number. I didn't open it. I checked the sender's name, saw his initials, and blocked it immediately. I also set a filter on my phone to delete messages from any unapproved numbers. 2 days after that, I got an email from my mother. Her tone was completely different. She blamed him for everything, said she was powerless at the time, that she'd wanted to reach out but was afraid. She mentioned that she had kept some of my school photos and claimed she thought I was happy at the academy. She said she hoped we could talk sometime. I replied once. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I just said that I was safe, healthy, and building my life without them. I told her I didn't want a relationship, that they had made their choices, and that I had made mine. I ended the message with one line, "Please don't contact me again." Then I blocked both of them, emails, phone numbers, any social media handles I could connect to their names. I double-checked every platform. I had removed any public-facing details and updated my privacy settings. I created a new digital identity for anything sensitive, banking, legal documents, mailing addresses. When I saw my therapist that week, I brought the whole printout. We went through every message, every response, every word. She didn't tell me I had done the right thing. She didn't tell me I was wrong either. She just helped me understand what it meant to choose a boundary and keep it. That night, I opened my journal and flipped back through the entries from freshman year. Notes about the return letter, the family photos I wasn't in, the job applications, the nights I'd stayed in the library until closing. I added a new page. I wrote out every interaction I just had with them. Not emotionally, just facts, what was said, what I replied, what I did. Then I started a new file on my laptop, draft 1. It wasn't a memoir, not yet, more like a personal essay series. I didn't start with the bad memories. I started with the train ride after graduation, the empty seat next to me, the silence. Then I wrote about the apartment, the meals I made, the part-time job at the bookstore. I laid it out 1 page at a time. This wasn't revenge. I wasn't planning to send it to anyone. It was just time to put it all somewhere solid, not for them, for me. Because if they were finally trying to rewrite the story, then I needed to make sure mine stayed true. A letter came through my university mailbox, forwarded from the main office. It had a legal firm's name and the return address and came with a sealed envelope inside. When I opened it, I had to read it twice to understand. My name had been listed as the emergency guardian for a minor, my half-sister. My parents were apparently planning to leave the country. According to the attached document, they had submitted forms naming me as the legal fallback in case of emergency. No heads up, no permission, just my name printed like I'd volunteered. I called the attorney listed in the notice. After confirming my identity, they sounded confused. They told me they'd been assured this was a family arrangement. I explained I was estranged and hadn't spoken to either parent in years. The line went quiet. Then they said they'd send me the necessary forms to contest the filing and apologize for the mistake. I used the savings from my internship to retain a lawyer the next day. We prepared a statement rejecting guardianship and included records showing my legal emancipation. I gave her a folder with my college registration, my financial aid records, and the journal entry documenting the return letter. She said it would help build a timeline. While pulling financial documents together, she ran a credit history search on me and found something worse. I was still listed on 2 unpaid medical debts from childhood hospital visits from over a decade ago. The charges had been aging in collections and were dragging my file down. One was from an urgent care visit when I was 11, the other was a pediatric hospital stay the same year. My parents had never removed my name, and the billing system hadn't flagged me as a minor when the debts transferred to a collection agency. We contacted the hospital and submitted my emancipation order, along with a sworn statement about the family estrangement. My lawyer sent a demand letter requesting full removal of my liability. It took weeks of back and forth, but the hospital finally agreed to clear the record once they verified I had never been responsible for payment. I made copies of every email and filed them in a binder. Then things got worse. My university's financial aid office requested a meeting. They'd received an anonymous report claiming I had undeclared support from family and wasn't eligible for certain grants. I had to produce every document again: legal status, tax records, bank statements. My lawyer stepped in and submitted a formal affidavit and court papers verifying my independence. After a full review, the aid office ruled in my favor, but the timing was too suspicious to ignore. I asked my lawyer to trace the source of the tip-off. She said we might not get a name, but if it came from a registered user or IP with a pattern, it could be subpoenaed in future legal matters. I gave her permission to proceed if needed. I wasn't going to let anyone undermine what I had worked for. After that, I went through every university record and requested a full update. I removed any remaining family fields, deleted their names from old forms, and added only verified, chosen contacts. The friend's mother, who had welcomed me over winter break, agreed to sign a notarized statement describing her role as my emergency contact and her history of support. We filed that with the school as well. One of my professors invited me to speak on a college panel about resilience and navigating independence. I agreed, but only under my first name. The panel was open to students and staff, and the turnout was larger than expected. I talked about systems, how they break, who gets lost, and what happens when no one notices. Afterward, a professor from the writing department came up and told me I had the bones of something bigger. Not a story for pity, but a case study on how easy it is for someone to fall through every crack if no one asks the right questions. That night, I started outlining chapters. I didn't start with the emotional parts. I started with paperwork, the lost medical records, the school documents, the fake guardian filing. I wanted facts that couldn't be twisted. As a final step, my lawyer filed paperwork to block my parents from ever using my name and legal documentation again. That meant no future filings, no guardianship claims, no estate planning where I'd be named without consent. If they tried, it would be considered fraud. We also added a statement to the court file that I had no contact and no obligations to any members of my biological family, present or future. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no closure email or final call, just a stack of signed documents, a closed folder, and a quiet night in my apartment. The version of me they once abandoned didn't exist in their paperwork anymore, and now, legally, I didn't exist in theirs either. It had been a few months since I'd legally shut every door linking me to my parents when I got another call, this time from Child Protective Services. They were trying to confirm if I was available to assume temporary guardianship for my half-sister. I didn't know what had happened until they explained that both my parents had been detained overseas in connection with financial fraud. Their daughter had been taken into custody by authorities and was now in the system. No other family members were stepping forward. I told the agent immediately that I had no relationship with her and was not a viable placement. I clarified that I had been legally emancipated for years and had been explicitly removed from any guardianship obligations. She said she understood and would pursue alternate options. That call lasted less than 10 minutes. What didn't sit right was how my name had made it back into the system again. I went to the county court database and requested copies of the public records tied to my parents' detention. Their defense paperwork had included statements listing me as an estranged but contactable adult relative, which was not only false, it was dangerous. They were still using my name to build the illusion of a functioning family. I contacted my lawyer immediately. We filed a sworn declaration to the court where the charges were pending. It included copies of my emancipation records, the previous disavowal of guardianship, and recent court rulings stating that I was not legally or ethically tied to them. My lawyer sent a cease and desist notice to their legal team, warning that any future use of my identity would be considered intentional misrepresentation. During all of this, I got a message request through an old academic email I rarely checked. It was from a cousin on my father's side, a name I hadn't seen in over a decade. It was polite and brief, asking if we could talk. I agreed to one call, no video, and through a monitored app. The cousin started by saying they hadn't known much. Apparently years ago, the family had been told I had behavioral problems at boarding school, that I'd been sent away for disciplinary reasons and had chosen to cut everyone off. According to them, the extended family was discouraged from reaching out, told that I'd moved on and wanted space. Then he told me something else. My half-sister had grown up thinking I'd left because I didn't care, that I had walked away. No one had ever told her anything different. I didn't want to drag her into this. She was a kid. She hadn't made the choices that landed her in the system or created the lies. So I wrote a letter, no accusations, no anger, just facts, that I had been placed in boarding school when I was 9, that I hadn't been picked up on graduation day, that I had reached out more than once and been ignored, that I didn't leave her. I wasn't even told she existed until I found her name by accident. I mailed it to the foster agency handling her case. No return address, no expectation of a reply. I just didn't want her to grow up believing she'd been unwanted by everyone. A few weeks after that, I got another email, this time from a journalist who had attended the college panel I spoke at months earlier. She was doing a feature on institutional estrangement and wanted to include my story. I agreed under one condition: no real names, no identifying details, and no photos. She respected that. The article was published in a niche education journal, but made its way around quietly. A nonprofit that supports foster youth and kids aging out of state systems picked it up and asked me to contribute to a TEDx-style event they were organizing. The theme was resilience. I accepted and used the same alias from the article. The talk focused on structural abandonment, how systems fail when people do, and what happens when no one shows up for a child, not just once, but over and over again. I didn't mention my parents. I didn't name schools or give cities, but I talked about waiting on curbs, about seeing other kids go home for holidays, about sleeping next to packed bags no one ever came for. When the event ended, a few people in the audience waited to shake my hand. No names shared, just silent thanks. Afterward, I walked out into the street and called the friend's mother, who had once given me a blanket and told me I could take food from her fridge. I told her I'd spoken at something that mattered. She said she already knew. I'd sent her the link ahead of time. For the first time, my past wasn't just mine. It had turned into something that didn't hurt when spoken out loud, not because it disappeared, but because I wasn't holding it alone anymore. A month after the TEDx talk, my lawyer received a message from a new attorney representing my parents. It wasn't a legal threat, it was an offer. They wanted me to release a public statement saying I'd always been in contact with them and that stories of abandonment had been misinterpreted. In return, they were offering a financial settlement. The wording was vague, but intentional. They wanted credibility back. They wanted me to erase the truth in exchange for silence. I didn't respond directly. My lawyer sent a cease and desist within the hour, stating that any further attempts to manipulate public narrative or coerce communication would result in legal action. We also updated the court file with the exchange, reinforcing the protective filings we had already submitted months earlier. That was the last we heard from their side. Through one of the nonprofit organizers who helped arrange the TEDx event, my story ended up in front of a literary agent. She reached out, saying the mix of documentation and lived experience could translate well into a book, something less about personal hurt and more about systemic failure. She asked for a writing sample and offered to guide the process if I was interested. I started drafting chapters the next week. I didn't try to make anything dramatic. I opened with the graduation day, the empty gate, the suitcase I packed myself. I focused on systems, the forms no one read, the records that went untouched, the names that disappeared from documents like they never mattered. I included court filings, journal pages, timelines. My writing professor, the same one who had encouraged me after the college panel, offered to help edit. She kept telling me, write for recovery, not revenge. That stuck. Around the same time, my lawyer got a different kind of message, this one from a school counselor. Not mine, but my half-sister's. She wasn't contacting me on behalf of the parents. She made that clear up front. The girl had apparently found the letter I'd written months earlier. She wanted to send a reply, just one, no contact beyond that unless I initiated it. I thought about it for a few days, then agreed under very specific terms, one-time exchange, monitored, filed through legal channels. Her letter came in a plain envelope, typed and carefully folded. It was simple. She said she'd always wondered about me. She remembered hearing my name in pieces, but never got a clear story. She didn't ask for explanations. She didn't make accusations, just curiosity. What had my life been like? Where had I gone? What was I doing now? I wrote back once. I didn't go deep. I told her I had gone to school, worked jobs, built my own life. I said I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because I had no choice. I told her none of what happened was her fault. I ended the letter with a line I hadn't written before. I hope you do well, whatever path you take. Then I signed my first name and left it there. The door wasn't locked, but it wasn't open either, just closed for now. That conversation brought up more in therapy than I expected. I'd spent years surviving, building, distancing, but I'd never thought about what kind of brother I might have been. That became the focus for a few weeks. what it means to show up for someone when no one ever showed up for you. Meanwhile, the TEDx video went live. I didn't promote it. I didn't even watch it at first, but it started getting quiet attention. Small shares in teacher forums, trauma circles, youth advocate pages. I got a few invitations to speak at community colleges and youth shelters. Nothing big, but enough. I started saying yes more often. One podcast host reached out through my agent, asking if I'd consider joining a series on reforming guardianship and institutional care systems. I agreed to a segment under an alias, focused on loopholes in boarding schools and legal neglect. I kept my voice calm, no dramatics, just the facts. Graduation was coming up, and for the first time in my life, I decided to mark it. No cap and gown ceremony, no announcements. I just invited 5 people to dinner: the friend who took me home during winter break, his mother, my writing professor, and 2 CO workers from the nonprofit. We met at a small restaurant near campus. They brought a cake that said, "On your terms." That night, walking home, I looked at the framed photo of my old boarding school I'd kept in a drawer for years. I placed it face down in the box where I kept court documents and unopened letters, not to throw away, just to stop staring at it. I wasn't the kid left behind anymore. I wasn't someone's unfinished obligation or secret. I was a graduate, a writer, a speaker, a friend. And for the first time, the only name on my life's paperwork was mine. A few weeks after graduation, my lawyer called me in. There was news about my half-sister. She'd officially been placed in temporary foster care. My parents, still detained overseas, were facing extradition to the United States on federal financial crime charges. While reviewing the court filings, the legal team found a problem again. My name had been dragged into their narrative. Their defense included a section about family stability. In it, they described me as a supportive older sibling who was actively engaged in the life of my half-sister. They referenced a relationship that didn't exist. It was a move to make them seem like responsible parents despite the evidence against them. I was subpoenaed shortly after to give a deposition. I didn't hesitate. At the deposition, I brought everything: scanned emails from the school asking my parents to pick me up, copies of the letter I had mailed after graduation, the one returned with no forwarding address, screenshots of the blocked messages, testimony from school staff who had watched year after year as I sat alone through holidays. I read out the timeline of everything I'd experienced, backed by paperwork. I didn't speak with emotion, just facts. Afterward, the prosecution told my lawyer that the deposition had helped destroy the narrative of a functional household. The judge reviewing the case admitted my testimony undermined their credibility. My name wasn't going to protect their reputation anymore. A few days later, I was contacted by a social worker overseeing my half-sister's case. She explained that her temporary placement wasn't going to last forever. If no family member stepped in, she would likely be moved into long-term care or a group home. She asked if I was in a position to intervene, not permanently, just to prevent her from entering the system completely. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I brought it to therapy. Then I brought it to the small circle of people I trusted: my counselor, the friend's mother, my writing professor. I asked them to tell me what they saw that I might be missing. Every person said the same thing in different words: don't become something you were never allowed to be out of guilt. I sat with that for a few days, then gave my response. I wasn't equipped to take care of a teenager. I had just graduated, was working contract hours, building a writing portfolio, and starting over from zero. I didn't want to step into a role I hadn't earned just because it would ease someone else's conscience. I told the social worker the truth, kindly, clearly, and finally. She thanked me for my honesty and said they would explore other options. Meanwhile, my agent asked for revisions to the manuscript. She said the book was solid on structure but needed more personal turning points, less legal documentation, more story. I went back to the early chapters. I wrote about the first time I realized no one was coming for me during winter break, about the locked mail cubbies, about the day a dorm supervisor let me sleep in the staff lounge because I didn't want to be alone in my room. While I was doing that, I got an invitation to appear on a well-known podcast that focused on trauma-informed education. This time, I agreed to use my real name. The host was professional. The conversation stayed on track. We talked about policy, about record-keeping, about how schools can be the only stable place some kids ever know. It didn't feel like exposure, it felt like contribution. Soon after, a nonprofit invited me to speak at their annual gala. They work specifically with youth aging out of residential programs. I debated turning it down. Public speaking wasn't my goal, but something told me this one was different. I said yes. The event was small but full of people who understood. I talked about documentation, how every lost record is a story that disappears. After the talk, an older woman approached me quietly. She introduced herself as a retired teacher from my boarding school. She had recognized my name when the event was announced. She told me she still had records, scanned copies of letters she tried to send to my parents, all returned envelopes marked address not found, recipient unknown, notes from faculty meetings about me being left behind year after year. She offered to email them to me. When the files came through, I sat with them for a long time. They were just images, just pages, but every one of them filled a blank space I'd lived with for years. Evidence, not emotion, proof that I hadn't imagined it, that the silence hadn't just felt loud, it had been recorded. I added them to the manuscript, not to accuse, not to make it more dramatic, just to make sure the next kid whose story looks like mine won't be told they misremembered. Some of us didn't fall through the cracks, we were pushed, and now I had the paper to prove it. My publisher forwarded me a message one morning from a verified legal guardian. It wasn't from my parents or their lawyers, it came from the appointed caseworker managing my half-sister's foster placement. The message was simple. She wanted to meet me, just once. It would be supervised, scheduled at a neutral location, and only if I agreed. Before I said yes, my lawyer and the caseworker confirmed she had reached legal age and had finished a full therapy cycle to prepare. There were no hidden motives, no pressure. It was entirely her choice. I agreed under strict terms, supervised, no personal contact afterward unless I chose it, and no emotional expectations set on either side. The meeting took place at a youth advocacy center near the city courthouse. We sat in a room with a counselor nearby, just observing. She came in quietly, carrying a notebook. She asked clear, careful questions about school, my life after boarding, the photo she had seen of me in the nonprofit newsletter. I answered honestly, but without diving too deep. I kept it about facts. I explained the years between when I left and when I learned she existed. She nodded a lot, but didn't cry. Toward the end, she admitted she'd always felt something was off, especially when my name began appearing in public spaces. First through the TEDx event, then through early mentions of the book. We didn't hug, we didn't make promises, we agreed to write occasionally, just letters, and only for a while. I told her to focus on graduating school, finishing her programs, and not to feel obligated to keep reaching out unless it felt right. That was the deal. Clear, respectful, and without weight either of us couldn't carry. The very same week, my manuscript was formally accepted by the publishing house's nonfiction imprint. The book would be positioned as a story about surviving institutional failure and reclaiming identity, not just abandonment. A photo shoot followed, a branding session with their marketing team. They had a stylist, lighting crew, even someone who arranged props to represent key parts of the story. I stood in front of a backdrop with a folded boarding school blazer draped over a chair. It felt surreal. They asked if I'd do media appearances, interviews, panels, maybe a television segment. I said no to most of them. I didn't want to become a spectacle. The whole point of the memoir was to bring attention to the systems, not the survivor. I asked them to focus promotions around youth programs and school administrators, not daytime drama shows or viral clickbait. Around that time, my old boarding school reached out. Someone from their administration wanted to include me in their alumni newsletter. They framed it as an inspirational success story. I wrote back directly and declined. I told them clearly that they had allowed the silence around me to stay too quiet for too long, that I wouldn't be another feather in their cap now that my name meant something publicly. A few days later, I got a letter with no return address, no name inside either, but the handwriting was familiar. The letter was long, pages of emotional reasoning, deflection, fragments of apologies stitched between sentences that blamed the past. It didn't acknowledge facts, just regret without accountability. I didn't reply. I handed it to my lawyer, who logged it under contact history. It would be stored, sealed, and referenced only if necessary. There was nothing left to say. After that, I went through every digital space I had, social media, professional platforms, public websites. I updated my privacy settings, restricted tagging, removed old university photos, and locked down all secondary contact options. I scrubbed any metadata that could trace my location. I took the next speaking fee I received and donated it anonymously to a fund supporting students in long-term foster placements. I didn't post about it, just wired the amount, sent a brief message to the director, and asked that it be used for transitional housing stipends. Then I began offering free weekend writing workshops at a local library for teens who had aged out of residential programs. No therapy talk, no group sessions, just structured time where they could write about anything: fiction, poems, songs, journals. The only rule was no one had to read it out loud. Most of them didn't, but they came back every week. As the release date for the memoir approached, I finalized plans for the pre-launch tour. Not a media circus, just select events at schools, youth shelters, and conferences where the conversation was about rebuilding, not retelling. I worked with the publisher to make sure every stop had resource tables, not just book stands. Every event had a mental health worker present, and every stage was shared with someone else doing work that mattered. This time, I wasn't asking anyone to show up for me. I was showing up for the people who never got picked up either. The memoir released in early spring. Within days, early reviews began coming in, quiet but steady. Most of them praised how it handled abandonment without turning it into spectacle. A few described it as clear-eyed, grounded, and more powerful for what it left unsaid. I read them once, made notes with my publisher, and went back to working on the next event. The national radio interview came in the second week. It was live, a segment on childhood resilience. The host asked questions about documentation, schooling gaps, and youth shelters. Then she paused and asked, "If your parents were listening right now, is there anything you'd want them to hear?" I didn't stall. I just said nothing needs to be said anymore. We moved on. After that, the publisher added me to a limited author tour, 5 stops across 4 cities, each one focused on survival stories and systemic gaps, housing, guardianship, reporting failures. I was grouped with other writers who'd lived through broken systems and rebuilt something. At every event, people stayed behind after the reading. Some waited in silence, some came up in tears. They didn't say much, just that they thought they were alone until now. At a small library in Philadelphia, a woman slipped a folded note into my hand. It was written in soft, neat handwriting, no return info, no signature, just a short message. "I read your book in foster care. I always wondered if I was invisible. Now I know I wasn't. Thank you." It was from my half-sister. I didn't mention it out loud. I tucked it into my wallet next to the old student ID I used to carry when I first moved into the apartment after graduation. Not for closure, just as proof that truth travels, even when family fails. A week later, I walked into a surprise book celebration. It had been organized by my closest friends and the friend's mother who first let me stay at her house back in college. There was a cake in the shape of a boarding school, but every door was left open. They made me read a page from the book aloud, then handed me a small framed certificate that said, "You showed up." That's enough. I kept it. After the tour ended, I got an email from a documentary director who had read a review in an educational journal. He asked if I'd be open to adapting the book into a series. I told him I'd only consider it if I had full creative control and final approval on all scripts. He agreed to a development meeting, and the project is now in early discussion. Around the same time, I started seeing someone. It was slow, no big talks up front, no full disclosures about courtrooms or schools. We went on walks, shared food, watched documentaries. We talked about books and future plans, not past breakdowns. For the first time, it didn't feel like I had to explain everything to be understood. There was room to breathe. A few weeks later, I was contacted by a legislative reform group working on guardianship laws and school reporting standards. They were preparing to present a bill on increasing transparency in custodial filings and wanted someone with lived experience to speak before the Education Committee. I wrote my statement over 2 days. I didn't tell a single story. I listed timelines, gaps, and oversight examples from redacted court records. I ended the speech by saying, "Kids shouldn't disappear between forms. We don't need to find them later if we don't lose them early." The room stood when I finished. That summer, a package arrived with no note, just a photograph inside, my half-sister standing on a school lawn, holding a diploma. No words, no return address, just her smiling. I framed it beside my own, one above the other, nothing flashy, just proof that 2 people who were never supposed to find each other had found a way through anyway. A few weeks after that, I filed the last round of documents with my attorney, papers to permanently remove my parents from all emergency contact listings, inheritance filings, and next of kin status. The court stamped the changes, and that was that. No one could ever list me again, no forms, no signatures, no assumptions. This fall, I took a solo trip overseas for the first time. I walked through a quiet town where one of the oldest boarding schools in Europe was located. I didn't plan the visit, it just happened to be nearby. I walked past the gate and paused for a moment. There were kids running through the yard, dragging suitcases, laughing. I stood for maybe a minute, then I nodded once, turned around, and kept walking. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the boy who was left behind.